most people, traveling alone is a frightening thought, and understandably so. However, it never really bothered me much. I've always been independent and sociable, so making new friends has always come naturally to me. That's probably one of the reasons I chose to become an au pair. I've also always wanted to be a child psychologist. I believe many of the world's issues could be reduced if children received better parenting and proper guidance. On top of that, experiencing life in America has always been a dream of mine, so working as an au pair seemed like the perfect opportunity. I come from Germany, from a small village near Ulm. Most Americans have never heard of it. So when people ask where I'm from, I usually just say Germany. It's easier that way. And before you ask, yes, I believe my English is quite good, or at least that's what people tell me. It has improved a lot since moving to the US, and I often get compliments on it. My father is originally from the UK and made sure I mastered English as well as my native German, if not even better. When I was a kid, I had an electronic dictionary that doubled as a translator, and I used to spend hours playing with it, translating words with my dad. I also read a lot when I was younger, which probably helped improve my language skills. My host family lives in an upscale suburb in Northern California, and their house is absolutely stunning. You might think living here would be lonely, but the agency does a great job connecting nearby au pairs, so I quickly bonded with a few girls from the area. My best friend here is an American girl named Jennifer. She's amazing. She's like me, just a bit louder and taller. We hit it off immediately and have been inseparable ever since. We're both here for the same reasons, working, exploring, and making the most of our time abroad. There's a large college campus nearby, and it's pretty much the only decent place to go out that doesn't require a $100 Uber ride. The frat and bar scenes are both lively, so that's where we usually spend our weekends. I've noticed that guys seem naturally drawn to us, probably because of our accents. The international card definitely works in our favor. Apparently, getting into frat parties without being in a sorority is tough, but we never really had an issue. That being said, we prefer the bars. Our favorite spot is this place called Tap. I've noticed that Americans love themed nights, Taco Tuesday, Wine Wednesday, any excuse to drink on a weekday. Funny enough, Tuesdays have become the highlight of the week for Jenny and me. This story takes place on one of those nights, a few months after I had arrived in the US. I was standing at the bar waiting for drinks for Jenny and me when a tall guy with curly brown hair approached me and said, "You're German, right?" That caught me off guard. People rarely guess my nationality correctly. European, sure, but not specifically German. I don't have very distinctive German features, so when someone gets it right, it always surprises me. I laughed and told him he was correct. He introduced himself as Sebi, flashing a confident smile. We chatted for a while, and everything felt easy and natural. I get approached often when I go out. I stay in shape and know I'm reasonably attractive, but most guys are pretty obvious and corny. Sebi felt different. The more we talked, the more it seemed like he was genuinely interested in me as a person, not just trying to flirt. He also knew quite a bit about German culture, which I appreciated. A lot of Americans I've met don't know much about the world outside the US, so talking to someone well-traveled and knowledgeable was refreshing. Eventually, I introduced him to Jenny, and he waved over his own friend, an Asian guy named Hunter. Jenny and Hunter hit it off immediately. The night was going great. Before we left, Sebi asked for my number, and I gave it to him without hesitation. A few days later, Sebi invited me over for dinner. When I arrived, I expected him to have made reservations somewhere, but instead he was cooking a homemade meal in his kitchen. It was sweet. I helped him prepare the food, and he opened a bottle of wine for us. I had such a nice time that I ended up staying the night. The next morning, as I lay in bed, I took a moment to look around his room. Unlike most college apartments, it was surprisingly clean. There were no posters or typical decorations, just framed black and white landscape photographs covering the walls, cityscapes, countryside views. They all looked strangely familiar. Curious, I got up and took a closer look. Each photo had a location printed on it. Every single one was from Germany, except for one of Monte Carlo, Monaco. By then, Sebi had woken up. I playfully asked if he had a thing for German architecture. He chuckled and explained that his father was an aerial photographer, and he had chosen some of his favorite pictures from his collection. As I moved back toward his bed, I noticed more photos above it. My heart stopped. One of them was a landscape of my hometown, an aerial shot of my village. The photo was taken just 20 minutes from my house. I pointed it out, amazed at the coincidence. Sebi seemed equally excited, asking me tons of questions about my hometown, which I happily answered. Over the following weeks, we spent more and more time together. Weekends, Tuesdays, going out, enjoying each other's company. He was always kind and considerate, and he got along well with my friends. But then little things started to seem off. One night, Sebi got significantly drunker than usual. As we walked back to his apartment, he kept rambling about how much he loved German women and how he had always wanted to marry an au pair because foreign girls are great with kids. It felt odd. Not a deal breaker, but unsettling. Later, when we went out for dinner, he chose an Italian restaurant, saying he picked it because it had plenty of vegetarian options. Sweet, except I never told him I was vegetarian. I jokingly asked how he knew, and he admitted he had seen it in one of my old Instagram posts. That thought lingered in my mind for the rest of the evening. Later, at home, I realized that post was from years ago, buried deep in my feed. How far back had he scrolled? The next time I stayed over while Sebi was asleep, I unlocked his phone. I had seen his password before. What I found made my stomach turn. There was a folder in his camera roll titled Wife, filled with screenshots of my social media, old posts, captions, tagged locations, even stories I barely remembered posting. His notes app was worse. Translations of my posts, a rough schedule of my outings based on my Instagram activity. And then, the worst part, a photo of my driver's license. Everything clicked. The second night I had gone out in the US, I lost my wallet at a frat party. My ID was inside. That's how he found my Instagram, how he knew everything, where I was from, what I liked, even my birthday. None of it was coincidence. He had orchestrated everything. Panicked, I grabbed my things and left without a sound. The entire drive home, my hands shook. I locked down my Instagram, blocked him on everything, and tried to move on. But a few weeks later, I started noticing a silver car parked across the street from my host family's house. He was still watching me. I'm gathering evidence for the police, but I've heard they don't take cases like this seriously. Fortunately, my au pair contract ends soon. I'll be back in Germany shortly. I just hope I never see him again. This happened a few years ago. Since childhood, I had always dreamed of living in Europe. More than anything, though, I wanted to work with children. I had a natural connection with them, and I knew that if my career didn't involve teaching or caring for kids in some way, I would never feel truly fulfilled. So when I discovered the opportunity to become an au pair in France, where I could use my high school French and be part of a host family, it felt like everything was falling into place. The decision wasn't easy. I was from Canada, and moving abroad was a big step. However, France had favorable visa policies for Canadians, making it a perfect chance to improve my French, Canada's second official language. Plus, I had a few friends in Paris, so I wouldn't be entirely alone. The biggest challenge was money. I had no financial support from my family, and I won't get into the details. That's personal. But I was on my own. Since I couldn't afford an expensive agency, I used a free au pair website instead. It wasn't ideal, but it was my only option. That's how I met Leah. Her ad was warm and straightforward. She needed help with her 2 children while her husband traveled for work. She seemed wonderful, very polite and friendly. During our video calls, she affectionately called me Chérie and Ma Belle, which felt different from home but had a charming, motherly tone. She asked a lot of questions about me, my experience with kids, and my views on family life. However, she didn't talk much about herself. Still, she seemed genuine, and I trusted her. The only thing that felt a little odd was that I never got to meet the children. I asked several times, but there was always an excuse. One was sick, one was at school, or they were out on a play date. She assured me that I'd meet them the moment I arrived. It felt strange, but I figured I would see them soon enough. Leah sent me a formal agreement. Everything appeared legitimate, and we finalized my start date. I booked my flight, packed my life into a suitcase, and said goodbye to Canada. When I landed at Charles de Gaulle Airport, Leah wasn't there. That surprised me because I had heard that most host families pick up their au pairs at the airport. Then my phone buzzed with a message from Leah. She said she was stuck in traffic and instructed me to go to a specific drop-off area where someone would pick me up. I used Google Translate on her message because it seemed like someone else was coming for me, and I wanted to be sure. My understanding was correct, and that unsettled me. Despite my unease, I followed her instructions. A few minutes later, a car pulled up and a woman approached me. She appeared to be in her late 40s, with short blonde hair and a bright smile. She looked nothing like Leah. She introduced herself as Leah's cousin and said, "You must be Leah's au pair. She sent me to get you." I hesitated. Something felt immediately off. I asked to speak to Leah and reached for my phone. The woman told me Leah was still driving and assured me that she was waiting for me at home. I called anyway, but the call went straight to voicemail. It didn't even ring. The woman kept smiling, insisting that everything was fine. I was confused and exhausted from the long flight. What was I supposed to do? Stand in the airport forever? So, against my instincts, I got into the car. As we drove, the woman kept the conversation going non-stop, asking about my flight, my life in Canada, and if I was excited about my new job. But when I asked about Leah or the children, she brushed it off, saying I'd love them and would meet them soon. The more she spoke, the worse I felt. She seemed too polished, too eager to keep me talking without actually answering anything. Then I noticed the scenery changing. I had Leah's address in Google Maps, and the route we were taking didn't match. Instead of heading toward the suburbs, we were moving into an industrial area. Panic set in. I felt like I was being abducted. I asked her directly where we were going. She laughed lightly and called it a shortcut, again reassuring me that Leia was expecting us. But by then, I knew she was lying. I demanded she take me back to the airport. She ignored me. I told her I would call the police if she didn't turn around. She told me to relax, but I wasn't backing down. The next time the car slowed, I seized the opportunity. I yanked the door handle, kicked the door open, and jumped out onto the street. The woman didn't drive off. Instead, she just stared at me like I was the one acting crazy. I grabbed my phone and called my mom, who told me to get as far away as possible and find help. As I spoke with her, I glanced through the windshield and saw the woman on her own phone, speaking rapidly in a language I didn't recognize. It wasn't French or English. A terrifying thought crossed my mind. Was she calling Leia? The street was empty, and there were no other cars in sight. But under no circumstances was I getting back in that vehicle. Then the woman opened her door and took a step toward me. I screamed that I was on the phone with the police. That finally made her stop. Without a word, she walked back to the car, grabbed my suitcase, threw it onto the road, and sped off. I memorized the license plate as she drove away. But at that moment, I was on the verge of tears, still clutching my phone. I had no idea what to do. Fortunately, I was able to hitch a ride to a friend's house. I don't know what I would have done without that option. My friend's family helped me report everything to the police, and later they even assisted me with the airfare back to Canada, something I was beyond grateful for. Eventually, the police provided an update. There was no registered au pair family under Leah's name. The phone number she had used was prepaid and untraceable. The pictures of the children had been taken from the internet. Everyone I've told this story to says the same thing. I was moments away from being trafficked. The scariest part was that I had spent all that money on plane tickets and ended up traumatizing myself for life. Looking back, I realize how lucky I was to escape. The whole thing was calculated from start to finish, and if I hadn't trusted my instincts, I might not be here to tell this story. It took time, but I eventually made my way back to France, this time through a verified agency. My hope is to fulfill the residency requirements and one day become a permanent citizen here. When I first arrived in the United States, I was 20 years old and working as an au pair. I didn't have much experience, but I was eager, though also quite nervous. I had grown up in a small town in France and had never been far from home, let alone across an entire ocean. My English wasn't perfect, but I was confident enough to manage. I expected the year to be exciting, an adventure, a cultural experience, something I could later share with my friends back home. I was placed with the Joseph family. For privacy reasons, I won't mention the exact town, but it was an affluent, quiet neighborhood with well-kept streets, beautiful houses, and large backyards, the kind of place where you'd expect polite children, PTA moms, and overworked fathers. I remember feeling relieved when I first arrived, thinking this would be easy. Nothing bad happens in places like this. The Josephs had 2 sons, Brock and Brandon. Brock, the older one, was 12. He was a fairly typical kid, sometimes lazy, occasionally rude, but generally harmless. He loved playing Xbox, made jokes, and mostly stayed out of trouble. Brandon, on the other hand, was different. He was 9 and already had an unsettling presence. I don't know how else to describe it. There was just something off about him. I suspect he may have had some undiagnosed social disorder. When we first met, he just stared at me silently. He wasn't shy or embarrassed, just observing me as if he were studying me. After several seconds, he finally smiled and asked, "Are you the maid?" I laughed awkwardly and explained that I was there to take care of him and his brother for the year. He didn't laugh back. He just kept watching. It didn't take long to realize Brandon wasn't like other kids. My host parents had warned me that he was difficult and had a bit of an attitude. That was the understatement of the century. Brandon wasn't just difficult, he was cruel. And I don't mean typical childhood mischief like teasing his brother or refusing to eat his dinner. It was far worse. He lied constantly about everything. Once he told his teacher that Brock had tried to strangle him in the kitchen, which never happened. He told a neighbor that his parents locked him in a closet at night. He even told me that the last au pair had run away because of him and was never seen again. When I scolded him, he narrowed his eyes and said, "Don't tell me what to do." At first, I could handle it, but I won't lie, I was starting to feel uneasy around him, and things only got worse. One night, about 2 months in, I pulled back my sheets and froze. Scattered across my mattress were dozens, maybe 100, thumbtacks, all pointing upward, waiting for me to lie down. My heart pounded as I stared at them. The mattress cover was full of tiny punctures. Earlier that day, I had caught Brandon spying on me. He'd been peeking through a crack in the door while I was folding clothes. At the time, I dismissed it as childish nosiness. But after seeing the thumbtacks, I wasn't so sure. I was terrified. I wanted to tell his parents, but I was afraid they wouldn't believe me. Or worse, that they'd send me back to France. So I cleaned up the mess and kept quiet. But from that point on, things only got stranger. Brandon started following me around the house. I'd catch him peeking around corners or staring at me from doorways. Sometimes I'd be cooking or reading, and I'd glance up to see him sitting across the room, watching me, without blinking. I never confronted him. Honestly, I was too afraid. One afternoon, I was watering the flowers in the backyard when I noticed a foul smell, a sharp, sour stench, like something rotting. I followed it to a corner of the yard where the soil looked freshly disturbed. Curious, I grabbed a small gardening shovel and started digging. When I saw what was buried there, I nearly screamed. 3 dead rabbits. Their bodies were twisted, cut in multiple places. One had its legs bound together with string. I ran inside to tell my host parents. Mr. and Mrs. Joseph looked concerned at first, but when they pulled Brandon aside and questioned him, he simply put on an innocent expression and said he had nothing to do with it. That was it. They believed him. Mrs. Joseph shrugged it off, saying it was probably some neighborhood kids. Then she told Brandon to go back inside. That night, I started locking my bedroom door. A week later, I woke up in the middle of the night to a noise in my room. I opened my eyes and saw a shadow standing near my bed. It was Brandon, and he was holding something. I blinked, trying to adjust to the darkness. Then I realized it was a kitchen knife. I screamed as loud as I could. By the time his parents rushed in, the knife had disappeared. Brandon had shoved it under the bed. He convinced them he had been sleepwalking. Mrs. Joseph gave me an annoyed look, as if I were overreacting. I pointed to the knife handle sticking out from under the bed and begged them to believe me. Mr. Joseph knelt down, pulled the knife out, and showed it to Brandon. He just smiled and said he had never seen it before. And of course, they believed him. I told them my door had been locked, meaning he must have picked it open, but they dismissed the idea as nonsense. I felt completely alone. I didn't know what to do, but a decision was made for me. The next morning, Mrs. Joseph called me into the living room and accused me of stealing her jewelry. I was completely confused until she held up a pearl necklace I had never seen before. In her other hand, she was holding my purse. She claimed she had found the necklace inside it. I begged her to believe me, swearing I had nothing to do with it. But it didn't matter. Brandon stood in the hallway smirking. I knew it was him. They fired me on the spot. The next day, I was on a plane back to France. I couldn't believe how easily Brandon had ruined my life. For months, I was devastated. I thought I had lost my only chance to build a future in the US. Fortunately, several years later, I was able to return. I now have a good job, great friends, and a stable life here. But I still think about Brandon sometimes, and I can only imagine what kind of person he's grown up to be.